And obviously you're joining at a very difficult time. I know that you've spoken about some of the tough calls that your agency will have to make given that budgets have been cut and may be cut again. Could you tell us what that means in practice? Will that mean fewer research grants being made? Will it go to fewer people, or maybe it will be? And would you know, how are you trying to tackle those problems?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very complex question that requires a full day to respond to in detail. But just to break it into smaller chunks, there are serious realities that we face. The first one is that we have a very constrained fiscus, where the public payers cannot even afford to fund all the priorities that the country has. In that regard, we then find ourselves with very small budgets, simply because government has to sort of juggle and then say, what do we really fund? An example would be if government has to prioritize between funding research versus healthcare, it becomes very easy to then say, let's fund the research. I mean, let's fund healthcare or cut funding for research. So when I spoke of the tough calls are not necessarily about whether it should be fundamental research or applied research. The tough calls are about the research areas within which one has to invest in. And what this means, it means that one has to then prioritize to say, you might have 50 fields of research, but can we fund all of them at the same time? Certainly not, with a limited budget. So how do we then prioritize the ones that we believe will actually bring much societal benefit to society quicker? Whether it's fundamental, whether it's applied research, that's not the question. We are saying that the areas that we then choose, we should then be able to fund fully. We do believe that research is a continuum. And in that case, it makes more sense to fund both basic and the applied research, but in selected areas. Yeah. You cannot have applied research if you do not have a basic research that's giving you the results that you will then apply. So it makes more sense for us to look into this. And I think, again, we also have to excite the researchers. If you look at how excitement comes into the researchers, it's when they're working on, problems where they believe that they're going to make a big impact. And to do that, it requires us to then look into a number of instruments that can actually vary from fundamental to applied, but creating a fully fledged value chain. So let me give you a small example here without getting into the details. If you look at, for example, a few years ago, in the 60s, Thomas Bronk, who was an American microbiologist, went into, I think he was on vacation at the time when he went to the thermal hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. And on this trip, he then isolated the bacterium, Thermus aquaticus. And this bacterium that he isolated is an enzyme which now, if you look at what is happening, is a very critical enzyme for the PCR test that is being used for COVID detection. You can imagine if that fundamental research was not done, probably a lot of research would have been not done as well, because there's a lot of research that built on that work that he has done. And you look at where we are now. We are now being able to isolate, being able to diagnose COVID-19 very easily because of the work that built on that fundamental research. So it's not a question of whether we are doing fundamental research or not. We should fund, but we just need to decide on which areas become areas of priority. Yeah. So I hope I tried to do justice to this complex question that you've asked.
Yeah. I mean, one question that is, one area that I'm particularly interested in is around the sort of PhD research training, because I know that is a big part of what your foundation does, and it's Indeed. Particularly important for South Africa and other emerging economies to have that, build that research capacity, even though it might be slow and you might not get the high impact papers straight away. How do you make the case to policymakers that is important, and you can't just be judged on the amount of citations you get and the amount of high impact papers? Is that a difficult conversation to have with politicians when you're asking for more money?
I think this question again is a complex one, and the conversation that one has to have is it's not just about the money, because I think when you look at it from a money point of view, it becomes very easy for one to say funding of research is not important, other than build people houses, because we have people who are complaining that they don't have houses. So to have this conversation requires us as the funding agencies, together with the research community, to go and be able to convince the politicians that you actually will get much more value by investing in research today, even if there are problems that are immediate that you're not being able to solve. Of course, on the other side, the politician will sort of sit and have to weigh this and say, but the same public that you're saying we should not fund now, we should not build their houses, we should not build their hospitals, are the ones who can actually vote us in or out. So how do we then balance this context? So I think this is a complex conversation. But what is very important as well is also to ensure that we then work together with the entire system, where we are saying, if you look at postgraduate students, we're not just funding them for the sake of funding these very people. They actually create a lot of new jobs when they leave the university system. So you fund them, they have master's degrees, what then happens? So I think that whole collective impact has to be packaged in a manner that we can then go and sell it easily to the politicians and say, it's not just funding an individual, but by funding this particular person and they do this, they then have students, they then have this. So you sort of have a fully fledged continuum. Many a times we struggle to actually package this in a manner that is sellable. And this is the reason why at the end, politicians find it very difficult to then forgo certain priorities. It becomes very easy to cut research, but it's because of how we sell this and how we package it. The conversation itself is a complex one, but I think all governments will have learned now during the pandemic that it makes more sense to invest in these. If we didn't do this, probably this pandemic, COVID-19, will have actually wiped the world out very easily. If you look at what we had in the past, the Spanish flu 100 years ago, this year, or rather this time, we don't actually have so many people who are affected as much as the 50 million people who were killed in 1980. Why? Because of that kind of research, because of the evolution that was funded. So the conversation can be complex, but I think they understand. It's an issue of juggling these priorities.